Now, I'm going to talk about the second act in a character-driven film. The work of the second act in a character-driven film is to show the incremental progression of the main character's internal journey. But the second act has very few structural markers to guide the writer. When you chart out your story structure on a timeline, you see a cluster of activity at the beginning to get the viewer oriented and launch the story, and then another cluster of activity at the end to resolve the story. These points serve as guideposts to let you know what functions must be served in starting up and winding down your story. But there's that long stretch in the middle where you're pretty much on your own. To be sure, there is much room for creativity in the second act, but such a long expanse to fill can be daunting. The good news is, screenwriters can gain the help of a very useful guidepost with a clear understanding of how the midpoint works in character terms. Here, as I said about the end of the first act in my previous video, I also find a remarkable consistency of function in the midpoint in film after film I study. In the plot-driven film, the midpoint is an initial attempt to solve the problem that either partially succeeds or completely fails. But a character story needs to serve the character's incremental transformation, helping the character get from point A to point B in stages. The midpoint helps with this progression by presenting a nearly cataclysmic external event, such as a major setback or a reversal that causes an internal shift in the main character that propels them forward. Notice how this fits with the action story. An initial attempt to solve the problem that partially fails will also present a nearly cataclysmic event for the character internally that motivates an internal shift. Up until this point, the main character could go back to being who they were at the beginning. But after the major event of the midpoint, the character crosses over the 50% mark, shifting their internal balance so that they're being pulled toward who they ultimately become at the end. Let's say at point A, your main character is at 0% of B. Then at point B, they have reached 100%. We've all seen movies where the character's internal progression starts at 0%, then goes 0, 0, 0, then 10%, 90%, 100. They stumble through the story until well into the third act, they suddenly undergo a miraculous change, and we're supposed to believe that henceforth they will be a new person. We know in real life, generally speaking, people don't experience sudden radical change. It happens gradually, over time. This is why, to make a transformation convincing in your character story, you need to make sure that at 1/4 of the way through the story, they are at 25% of B. Halfway through the story, they are at 50% of B, and so on. Now consider the point where a character goes from 24% to 25% to 26%. What is the cumulative difference there? Not that much. However, at the point where the character goes from 49% to 50% to 51%, there's a huge cumulative difference. A tipping of the balance between 0 and 100. It's the difference, for example, between winning the election and fading into obscurity. Before this shift, the main character behaves one way. After, he or she behaves another. Therefore, the 50% mark also serves to differentiate the first half of the second act from the second half, which is an extremely helpful guideline for organizing that hour-long expanse of story in the middle. If you're having a hard time picturing how this works, that's because you need concrete examples. I have a very good example of the midpoint shift in my screen book Analyzing Thelma and Louise that will help you see more clearly how it actually functions in story terms. You can get that analysis by going to screentakes.com/screenbooks or clicking the link in the description below. You will see in that analysis how the midpoint is like a fulcrum that causes an actual shift in the balance of the story. However, there are a couple of distinctions worth noting here. First, the midpoint is a nearly cataclysmic event, which means it needs to be big enough to give an internal jolt to the main character that will push them over the 50% mark. But second, the main character is still only 50% there, which means the midpoint does not make the ending inevitable, it simply makes it possible. If the ending were inevitable, the story would be over. Clearly, there is still work to do for the main character's transformation to be convincing. The writer must continue to progress the main character's internal growth in incremental stages. Through the second half of the second act, the main character experiences more and more external pressure until finally at the end of the second act, we see an internal change that leads us into the third act. I like to talk about the function of the end of the second act in a discussion of the third act to underscore how it works with the climax. That will be the subject of my next video. So be sure to subscribe so you'll be notified when that video is posted. Or go to screentakes.com/screenbooks to see a concrete example of how character transformation structure works.